My name is Marc Fornes. I'm the principal of THEVERYMANY, which is an architecture, design, and public art practice here in Brooklyn, New York. Yeah, it's an interesting start. I think I knew I wanted to be an architect since very, very young. I recall very well, I must have been 7, 8 years old. Everybody in school knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to be a fireman, policeman, whatever the boys wanted to do at the time. And I came to my dad and said, hey, I don't really know what really I want to do. And he said, what do you like? And I said, hey, I like to draw. And it's true, I was spending my time drawing. And mathematics. And it took him 2 seconds and he just said it like that. Hey, what about an architect? And I understand more now. They were still visiting a lot of houses at the time, etc. So he must have inspired me. But he came on very early on as that, hey, why not an architect drawings? It's rigorous, there's mathematics involved, you're building something. And very early on in school, I started to do some, not internship, but more kind of shadow, if you will, visits. And I was not even in high school. I already visited someone who was doing those early 3D renders, images, etc. To a point that when I arrived into my baccalaureate, which is the end of high school in France, I keep saying to people, asking, what do you want to do later? I want to be an architect. But when I arrived there, I was like, am I really sure I'm going to like it? And I fell right in. I think for me, it was really that moment discovering, architecture school and all the possibility was a win for me. Well, the parcours is intriguing to me, looking backwards. I'm born in Strasbourg, which is the border between France and Germany, a very loaded area, historically speaking. And that's I learned with time that it was very impactful to me. For example, my great-grandparents changed 4 times nationality, German, French, German, French. And it means something to be born on a line. You understand that it's never just one logic, it's never just one perspective to some extent. And also my parents, my mom, for example, was working in the Council of Europe, an institution, in a way, fighting for the great of the good, whereas my dad was working in the industry. So we had always those interesting debate, interesting discussion at home. And when it came about studying architecture, and first thought, where would I? So I applied everywhere in France to some extent. There was 22 schools of architecture at the time, I remember very well. And was taken one, and the first result I got was in the south of France somewhere, and I was like, oh cool, I can go surfing there, I can study, etc. But eventually I decided to stay in Strasbourg and study there, and there was an interesting school for many aspects. Because we were on that line, we had many different nationalities of people who came to study but also to teach. And we had all sorts of people coming from the Tessin, which are a very strong Swiss architecture. We had all the French modernist inspired people who were there. Our school was very pro-Corbusian to some extent, but we also had people coming from the Netherlands with background, etc. And at some point, we were offered the possibility to do what we call an Erasmus, which is a exchange year. And my parents at the time, long before, had sent me for a summer traveling through Scandinavia, going from Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, etc. And I always thought if I have to stay somewhere, I would go there. So I went for a year exchange trip in Stockholm, Sweden. And there it was opening eyes. There was a lot of people, actually a lot of young firms at the time that came to do workshops. So we had a lot of people from the AA, for example. We had all the Ocean at the time. One group was called Ocean, for example, who came and taught there. But also if you had to study a topic, they would send you to travel there. You would study wood architecture, they would send you in Switzerland. You would study informal settlement, they would send you 3 weeks in South Africa. At the end, during that year, I think I traveled 23 different countries through the school to some extent in 1 year of study. So I came back to finish my diploma with a very different mindset, and it has been quite an experience to do actually the diploma in a very Corbusian school, and yet having been, inspired by so many of those different other schools, going from the AA to some very different tracks. So it was interesting. It was interesting. So a little parenthesis was my diploma. My diploma at the time, I was like, hey, what's the point of doing, to some extent, drawings about a building that will never happen, which is a typical diploma in France. And I thought, thinking about what inspired the school and Corbusier and other great architects, was like, what about replacing the diploma by a final long journey, a trip somewhere? And the funny story was like, I was like, hey, if I have to do a trip, why not trying to do one of the longest in the world to some extent? So I went and took the Trans-Siberian train, which is the longest train going through Russia for that part, and try to tell the story of what you learned through that journey and tell it as an architectural building plan. It was an entire battle, as you can imagine, to present that into a very, again, modernist school. But eventually got my diploma, started to work, and I recall that very clearly. At some point, I was like, after 6 months, I stopped on a Saturday afternoon in a supermarket in the middle of the alley, and I was like, okay, that's the rest of my life, in a way, to some extent. I already had a great position in a firm. We were doing interesting work, what I thought at the time, for competitions, etc. And that Thursday night, I remember it forever. I was eating with my mom in a restaurant, and I was like, hey, I would go back to school, actually. I think I would actually go back to school. And my mom was like, okay, yeah, why not? And that night I was on the web. It was too late to apply to any of the US university. And so I ended up at the AA. And that's where it started, in a way, that long succession to arrive where I am today. The question of a mentor is always a good question. It depends as well. Is it like figures who inspire you, or is it literally a mentor, which is an active person that supports your career? And I think, in my case, I would have to mention 2 names. I keep mentioning them to some extent, which are persons that I actually never met in person. Is Marc from Decoy Architects, and Lars Spybrook from Knox. And I think both inspired dramatically what I'm doing right now, in both as an example and a counter-example. As an example, because by the time of early 2000, 2003, 4, something like that, they were actively trying to build, actively trying to actually, not just stay in theory, not just say, hey, that beautiful blob is an opera or something like that. They were actually trying to make whatever they were interested in. Lars Spybrook were doing those early grid aluminum or steel, I forgot, space frame, etc. That early use of the digital, not just for the generation of shapes, but also to make them and make them as permanent as he could. It was not just exhibition work, installation. He was making it, and Gultorf the same, was trying to do it in composite, trying to deal with the precision, trying to do that thing. But unfortunately, so very inspiring, but unfortunately both somehow, somewhere, got very attractive position in academia, and somehow, got maybe too comfortable to some extent and stopped their practice, stopped producing. And I think for me as a mentor, that was really eye-opening to some extent. And when I came out of school and started to get all those offers of different US universities to teach, it was very intriguing and it was very flattering and very inspiring for my own work as well. But when it came down to trying to be tenure, for example, I always said no. Every time people has approached me to actually teach, and it was for that reason. I always saw that as a golden jail where you stop producing to some extent, or you produce by procuration through the work of your student, but it's never your own work. You never have, you never hunger to produce, you never need to produce. And I think I always wanted to keep that, so that would be my mentor, if any, to some extent. I think the interest of the studio in general is evolving across time, obviously. I think first historically, coming out as a young graduate, coming out trying to establish a practice to some extent, a research-based practice was trying to be invited into show was the things you would have access to. You wouldn't have any client, but you would have friends into academia or everywhere else who would invite you to do a show. You would present model instead of just sending boards or sending video. You would take the effort of trying to produce something physically. That was the kind of goal number one. That became larger and larger and was like, hey, rather than sending a model, let's try to send something where you can actually inhabit it, like at least that it's as scale one as you can. And scale one was defined there as by, at the very least, at the beginning, I should be able to pass underneath it. It became an arch. At least I should be within it. It became a small space, a small shell, etc. And then the goal was like, hey, it's interesting as work, but most of it is temporary. It's such an effort, such an energy to build something for such a short time and often get destroyed after because, often those installations travel with us in our suitcase to wherever it is, but there was no way back for that part. So it became like, hey, can we make work permanent or permanent first? So we started to build them larger, stronger, engineer them, trying to figure out also the economy, because we were not part of academia, we did not get grants, we had to figure out budget, where can the funding come from, where can the support come from, where can the sponsor, all the kind of ecosystem of trying to build those projects permanent. And that's how we discover randomly, to some extent, the world of public art. First he went through institutions, the Centre Pompidou, supporting us for the first larger one. We had the Frac Centre, very instrumental in France, who supported 2 of the projects. We had the Fondation Calder, but it was still kind of, temporary or part of permanent collection than temporary work. But through that, we had started to identify the work of the art world somehow, the funding through one side of the art world, which is a very specific one, is the public art to some extent. So that allowed us to get funding. It was, okay, now we have fundings, we have to figure out how to make it. And we started to make those projects, and each of those cycles often, for some reason, took about 3 years of development, test, trial, error, get more, better, etc. And when we arrived to the first permanent, the question was like, hey, do we really want to be doing that? Like, meaning, do we want to be the one designing? Do we want to be the one doing all the optimization, the shop drawings? Do we want to be the one fabricating, assembling, dealing with the logistic, etc.? And that's where that kind of branching came by, where we're like, okay, maybe we stay on the side of the design while we don't stop as a traditional architect at the construction documentation. We literally do the machining files, the shop drawings, and things like that. We didn't want to be the one actually fabricating, bending the metal, anchoring into the concrete, etc. For that part. So that changed everything. It meant that suddenly, while we were able to generate a 3D form, we were able to describe that 3D form as a set of simpler elements. We suddenly wouldn't be the one fabricating those parts, neither assembling them. So suddenly we had to figure out also into the ecosystem a place, a way to communicate with somebody else, and a way to afford that someone else. So suddenly, optimization took a very different approach to us. We suddenly had to optimize not because it's a fancy academic word, we had to optimize because every line we draw has a cost, has a time associated, has a complexity associated to that. It had to be understood by someone else, it had to be easy enough for that person to build it, that it's interesting for him, and it has to be commercially affordable for him or interested for that part. So the aim at that time was to be permanent, but then suddenly the objective was that we could develop that ecosystem so that somebody else can assemble those permanent structures. So that came again kind of a 3 years time, if you will, and then became, okay, permanent was not enough anymore. Can we be permanent outdoor? Outdoor means all sorts of different ways our structure are submitted to, meaning, obviously wind loads, very strong, very dimensioning factors for our structure, but also means live loads, means all sort of drunk proof, as we call them at the studio, because anything can happen when you leave an object in the public space, etc. So that became the new goal from the studio, was can we build those digital and computational research that we did early on for the studio. Can we build them? Can we build them by other? Can we build them by other permanent outdoor? And once they were outdoor was where we are now. It's the race to scale to some extent. We're trying to build them larger and larger, more and more engaging. It's trying to also have more and more different type of program inside, so that there is not just one system as well. The system has to adapt to other ecosystem, because you're not just that object landed onto a concrete pad or stuff. So that's, I think, right now the objective of the studio is we are really trying to still be true to our roots in terms of experimentation. Is still very strong in terms of digital, in terms of computational, because the digital was, let's say, the generation before me. We were more the computational one. And we're still having an emphasis onto all those systems, those tectonic, those very unique self-supported structure, but also those very unique segmentation and structural stripes for that part. But the goal is scale right now. We're trying to build as large as we can. One reason is also in order to be able to engage the largest crowd as possible as well, rather than being that small folly into a park. You want to be something much larger who can host larger events, larger programs, so that you engage more people start to be able to experience in a way what started as that digital experimentation. Yeah, I think there is a fascination about permanent work, which is also, once it becomes installed, finished, completed, it's out of your hands. Whatever happens will happen in both ways. And I think what's really fascinating is the interaction of people, and we take extremely care, because we still remember that very first time. It was a project in Edmonton, Canada, where we just opened the fence once we've completed that one of the first permanent structure, and a bunch of kids went and ran to the structure. Like, oh, great, they want to play, it's already kind of, success is accomplished to some extent. It did not leave them, it's not just decoration on their path, that beautiful thing on the side. They want to engage, they want to inhabit, great. But what we did not expect at first was the parents were running behind them. And we thought, okay, interesting, the parents are also running. We understood only later on that the parents were running because they were scared. They were concerned, actually, that the kids would hurt themselves or that the structure was unstable, because it's so thin, it's so hard to believe that it's possible for that part. So, but then the parents were actually running behind and started to play with them. And we understood that if the kids play, the parents come, watch them, play with them, spend some good time, quality time in the structure. Let's just say it's on a weekend, on a Saturday afternoon, and in the Saturday night or evening they have a dinner with friends, they will talk about that. If they talk about that experience, their friends or family or whoever they talk to might want to experience the work. And they might bring their friends to the piece or the project itself. And we realize the difference in a way there right away of between, what is placemaking, very trendy nowadays, everything has to be about placemaking, and culture making. And the culture making is really that, is not only you have created an element that is highly identified, highly attractive onto that site, but also there is a loop of people going there, talking to other people, those other people wants to come there, etc. And the piece start to be part of the urban fabric, start to be part of the community, etc. and be successful for that end. And I think that's where we suddenly understood what interaction meant. And since then, we're really trying to anticipate best we can, but also monitor, so that we can predict for the next one. And what we have noticed, or first, let's say, the tool we're using is, for example, social media. Social media is one, when you build something somewhere all around the world, you see those structures once, twice, 3 times maybe, but not more. And for that or not that often. So we use social media and hashtags to actually monitor how people are using those structures. When are they using? Is it something you get photographed more at the end of the day, earlier the day? Is it something that is only successful on a weekend, during the week? What are people doing? You would not, it's unbelievable what people take picture of themselves in front. Is it actually more selfies or is it more picture of the work that we observe? So all that type of thing. And 2 things we've noticed is one, straightforward, the kids. The earlier, the younger you are, no preconception. You run to the work you want to play hide and seek, you want to play between you through the columns, through the labyrinthine of it, you start to observe. But the older you are, the more, you've been educated, you have a background, you have things, you live into that white box for most of us, where there is columns, there is beams, there is thickness, and suddenly you see that thing which is, paper thin, standing on that field, and you're in total disbelief. How is it possible? And we've noticed that the older they are, the more the first reflex is that it's a pause, and then they go to the opening and touch the edge to understand how is it possible that thing to be that tall and sustain everything and not be dangerous. And I think that was the reason why those first parents ran after their kid at the first place. They thought he was unsafe at first. No, I just think the reason why I can't pinpoint it to one very specific experience is because I believe as an architect or something, you're always on. Your radar is always on. I have some sort of, I'm terrible at names, but I have a visual memory. I can tell you which pair of sneakers you will have that day or something. Not about fashion, but it's just you're constantly looking at details, at moments, what works, what does not work to you, at whatever the property, how the light hits something or something like that, and you're constantly on, I would say. So it's hard to say that there is one experience that top everything, because we are laughing sometimes with my wife because we're scared that our daughter might want to become an architect. And then, we've never actively pursued that, but it's kind of logic to some extent because, you're anywhere, you spend your time looking at something, looking into a space, making a comment about it, looking at a color, looking at a detail, a fashion moment, thing. So in a way, she's influenced to some extent, but I wouldn't say there is one that top it all. There is more. There is some. I would say there is some rather than experience that has actually influenced the production more than other. I would say there is a few comments from a few different people that we keep in mind to some extent. And I always remember the comment because he did say that he was part of a logic also of not only design, but also design build. And it is something that very strongly influences the work we do. We are not just designer, we often do design build, which means you have actually at stake, you have stakes into the games, which means you take decision in a very different ways than just advising a client hoping for him to do the right choice based on financial sometime. I think it's an interesting the position of the studio in a way into the evolution of the digital becoming the computational, etc. I still got taught to learn or to draw. I'm part of that transitional generation, but with one difference is very early on I had access to some computer and I still remember my first Mac Draw painting things onto that thing. Also the very coding into AutoCAD very early on when I had no interest. That was just because we were taught that at school at some extent. But towards the end of 90s, before I kind of picked up upon that, digital was seen at best as some sort of high-end tool, often being Maya, for example, or things like that were specialized for other fields, that were used as to play with and get some sort of geometry that we would put words on it. You would suddenly get that blob would become an opera house, that depending on the scale, that wall would become something for new use without specificity, etc. But there were no active ways to build those things at first. And I think that's where my generation came in to some extent, where there was that envy to actually build those geometries, actually make them happen. And we realized very quickly that, very different avenues were there. Some were going through the digital project, Katia, those very expensive tools, which were a nightmare in terms of team management. It was a very great modeler, but the team management was crazy. And I just remember working and had 1 week of vacation, and at that time, and I thought, hey, what if we could resolve the problem we had at the office where I was working through a different way, and instead of using a high-end tool, what if we use a dumb tool, something very simpler, which has only one specificity, being great at geometry, and code within that. And I taught myself within 1 week to start coding into, at the time it was Rhino, forgot which version. I want to see, it was Rhino 3, if I remember correctly. Anyway, for that part. And that very quickly I was competing. First I was slower than to draft it. Then I was at the same pace. And then very quickly the curvature became like, you became much faster to be able to generate or describe geometry than if you would have had to build up or drafting something. And so we actually part of that generation where we were actively coding. We were coding, like all the very early work of the studio were 100% generated, 100% described, up to the digital fabrication. It was done through words, through actually coding. Part that was before Grasshopper. We're talking about, I don't know, maybe 2003, 2008, something like that. Given taken, time passed so far. And that was that idea of, of precision as well. There was both that idea of precision, but also uncertainty. Precision because, if your geometry, your tessellation is the result of very precise steps because you've coded everything. You've not used any high-end tools, any black box. The problem of the tools before, they had black box where you have no idea what the tool is actually computing inside. You know more or less the output, so you learn by trying, move a slider, input a value, see how it reacts, adjust, learn through that. But when you're actually coding, you're just at best, you're into the geometry world, but otherwise you're also into the mathematic world. It's a very different thing. When you move something, is not you take move, you literally translate, adding the coordinates, etc. Onto that, just to give an example. So there was hyper precision But on the same time, there were uncertainty because when you build a code and you build lines of code, by the time you arrive at a certain length, even though if you optimize it, and for me optimize was critical because if your tool or your code takes time to run, it means suddenly that you cannot design. If every time I press on execute, it takes a few minutes, and I had friends where it would take, hours to run for that part, it means you're going to run it once, twice, you might be able to debug, but you're never going to run, 100 variations. It's much too slow. So the length did matter. So through the length, you build uncertainty because while every step is hyper rigorous and precise, the sum of the steps are extremely hard to anticipate. So that's what the work of the studio in terms of computation started. We were not just about, generating form was the fascination aspect of computation, but suddenly was really about that way, not rationalized in terms of, hey, it takes that complex element and make it out of simpler element. It was really how do you describe that very precisely and through coding. So that was that moment. Then came the beginning of Grasshopper, let's call it that, and I would say very quickly became a soup, where it suddenly became accessible, and it was not anymore so much about trying to push the boundary. And when I say push the boundary, it was, try to fail outside in the world, in the physical world. That will give very set of specific problem. If you bring back that into the digital and try to find solutions there, you have a chance to become, in a way, unique and specific. So that part. When Grasshopper came, it became more about, hey, what is that earlier type of work has been doing that I could not do because I was not able to code. The learning curve of coding was pretty extensive for that part. But how do I reproduce that in simple part? And I call it the soup because it's often, we all say the same, 95% of the project can be done into 5% of the time you spend on that project. And that is that kind of more graphical interface based, and we get that discussion in the studio more and more to some extent because we have less and less understanding on what those nodes, those tools are doing. Yes, it's supposed to relax something, but how precisely are we supposed to relax? Whereas when you're in the computation world, there is no relax. Relax means something in terms of moving means something in terms of coordinates that you have to add, in which direction, in which way, how many times, etc. So you understand, the range of a parameter is not just discovering, I can put 50 as a value. No, I can also put 500 and see what's happening, or 5,000, because I don't really have a precise understanding of that. So that's a little bit how the computational has evolved through the studio. It started by the model, the precedent, which were, raw, let's call it, generation of geometry, early doubly curved surfaces, but very little control in a way to build it. At best we were trying to vacuum form them, but the vacuum form has a certain size. Then how do I assemble two pieces of vacuum form? Or maybe I just fold it because that's the architect detail. I fold, and maybe I use some zip ties or I use something else, something like that. In our case, it was a little bit different. It was, okay, we have that model we want to build. We understand that not everybody has a budget to build, everything out of carbon fiber, molded element, etc. We need to do a material that is common, cheap. So we need to figure out how do we translate that material with that form and how the form reacts so that both work together and not against each other for that part. And that's how we went through that precise control as opposed to the kind of generational of geometry aspect. And then it became not anymore about, hey, I can describe that shape into endless amount of unique parts. It's becoming about, hey, how can I describe that same geometry into the least amount of parts for the project? So that again shifted into the production of the studio from, in a way, the name of the studio, which is THEVERYMANY, that early aspect of computation. We can take what looks like being a complex surface and describe it into a very specific set of parts instead of rationalizing it out of repetitive element. To now, in a way, it's the very least, what is the minimum amount of parts that I actually need to describe the same space? Because eventually, while we are fascinated about the digital or the computational or the fabrication or the robotic on the way, at the very end we are architect and we are about the space at the very end. I think there is parallel and difference between that idea that a digital set of instruction is the active way of constructing, or the digital set of instruction has to be translated to a more craft way of building. There is, where till where can you push that variant? I think there is scale is important. I think, a reach of an arm or a gantry has certain limit. After you can distribute that as smaller robot as well, etc. But I think for us, what's really important is if you can keep that control as far as you can go through the process, you can put metrics. If you can put metrics, you can have an educated discussion also in terms of budget at the end. And that comes with the design build to some aspect. Actually, what's interesting about the computational aspect that we've noticed, which come out, is, like I said, because we are not the one on site or not the one actually in the shop fabricating, for that part, we've noticed different behavior. And recently we had a team assembling our projects that were actually, rather than using our 3D model, we have teams which are there with their iPad on site, with some with their laptop on site, we're going back to a paper model. They were actually printing all sorts of instruction, in a way a little bit like you can imagine the IKEA instruction, and we were surprised at first. We were wondering, we asked them, hey, why are you going backward? Why are you actually going into the set of paper and things like that? And they said something very intriguing to me, who stays with me, is, because it's not digital, because it's printed on a piece of paper, there is no hierarchy on site. When there is a problem, everyone on site in the team can give his opinion. When there is a 3D model, while it's pretty easy to surf basically around it, when you need to zoom, change the logic, change the sequence of assembly, it requires a stronger skills to some extent. And therefore, it brings an hierarchy on site, which means there is one person or a set of persons who are going to think about the problem, trying to think a solution, and be ready the next day to develop around that problem. Whereas when it's on paper, every guy, the guy who places a rivet, the guy who places a part, can have an opinion and can go figure out a solution on his own, and he can be far more decentralized as an assembly. And while it's not what we believe initially, it sticks with me, and it's something we're kind of thinking about, how can we help with our computational side still to allow them to have that distributed set of decisions happening on site, as opposed to a very hierarchical model for that part. I want to learn how to drive a car faster, that's for sure. No, I think, like I said, I think the studio is very focused right now on growing in scale in terms of project, but also, it's a constant focus in day one is to make them happen. That's a day-to-day basis. It might sound easy, it might sound easier as time passes, but every project, new challenges, new sets of problems will come along. But the scale is the one that we're interested in. I think I won't rest before we've built something as high as the Eiffel Tower.